Good evening all and welcome to Nature Week. For you all this week, we have an absolutely amazing collection of scary stories. So be sure to tune in Monday through Friday for all brand new content. I'd like to give a special shout out to Ava, who actually was in one of these stories. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I have two stories from my late grandpa that took place in rural Yugoslavia, present-day Serbia, between the mid-40s and early 50s. The first one is about a being or thing called the Drekavac, which literally means the one who screams. Folklore says it's the spirit of a dead child that screams and can latch on to travellers and shepherds. My granddad was a young man when he had an encounter with this being. Back then, people would travel by foot from village to village at night. This being the 50s, there was no lighting whatsoever on the paths between villages. My granddad recalls returning home to his own village after a social gathering in another village tens of kilometers away. It was completely dark, and he remembers hearing a loud screaming sound like that of a fox or dog. Sounds like that were of course normal, but this time he felt something jump on his back, like a heavy being that made him hunch over because of its weight. He said he was too terrified to even fight it off, and just kept walking and walking until eventually he came closer to a lit village, when it just jumped off and left. I remember asking him on multiple occasions if he's sure it was a real physical thing, or if it was just his mind playing tricks on him because of the fear and folklore stories. He was always completely convinced that this being was really latched onto his back and did not let go for a long period. He always told me this story like it was a thing that could and did happen to people that travelled at night. He never seemed traumatized about it. It was just part of life back then. The second story is creepier to me because it doesn't have a folklore background. This was when my granddad was a child. He used to sleep in one bed with his kid brother and his mother. This was in a one-room cabin-like house, and one night he woke up in the middle of the night and saw a pale-faced woman dressed in all black next to their bed, completely terrified. He tried to wake his mother up, but she brushed him off and did not fully wake, probably tired from rural 1940s life. The cloaked woman took his kid brother from the bed, exited the house, and disappeared from the woods. Eventually, my granddad managed to wake his mother, and she noticed her younger son was indeed missing and alarmed the other villagers. A group of them, including my granddad, ran into the woods to look for the woman and his brother. Granddad recalled it being a long search until dawn started to come in. He said he didn't find him until they heard the first roosters, meaning they found him when the sun came up. When they found his brother in the woods, he was okay, not badly hurt, but he had scratches all over his body. To this day, that's all the information we could get out of him about that. When I was still in school, I would normally take the bus most of the time until I got my license. The bus stop wasn't far from my house at all. It was just a few blocks. There were two separate paths that you could take to get there from my house. One was just walking along the road and taking a right, walking down some more road until you'd be there. The second path was just a straight shot to the shop, but it was through a patch of very thick forest. The first path was maybe a 15-minute walk, while the second path through the forest was about a 10-minute walk. I was running late one day and decided to take the path through the forest. It was the start of winter, so it was pitch black outside the time I had to wake up for high school. I was a freshman at the time. I started on the path and kept my face pointed forwards despite the eagerness to look over my shoulder at every little snap and crack. But just as I saw the bus stop through the trees, I heard a very loud snap, like a tree had just been ripped apart. It was so loud that it echoed in the fields and the surrounding area. I stormed forwards, terrified out of my mind. Thankfully, there was another kid there. I think his name was John or Jay, and we were in the same grade. So I debated bringing up the loud crack, but I didn't want to make myself sound crazy if he somehow didn't hear it. But he beat me to it and said, "Dude, what the hell was that? Did you hear that?" Mind you, it was still pitch black out there. We could barely see each other standing like 2 feet apart. I didn't know him very well since he was newer to our school, and I didn't really want to bring much attention and thought that if it was something supernatural we should just ignore it. So I simply nodded, and he picked up on my unwillingness to talk about it and also just nodded. I was standing way closer than I normally would, since I'm incredibly awkward, so I would just stand on the opposite side as everyone else. But this was a special exception, so I just stood a few feet away seeking just a semblance of comfort from what had just occurred. He went on his phone, and so did I, but it felt like something was watching me. Not behind me, but in front of me. I just moved my eyes to look, keeping my head down, and saw a figure dash into view about 13 feet away. It looked like a deer, which is very common from where I'm from, so I just ignored it until I felt so uneasy I had to take another glance. And that's when it stood up. Stood. I looked over at the other kid, hoping that he had also been seeing that, but he was glued to his phone. I looked back, and at the same time whatever the hell that thing was looked at me. It was still dark as night, so I couldn't make out any facial features. It looked back, then got back down on all fours and ran so incredibly fast that it was a blur. It ran back into the field that was just behind it, and not a minute later, the bus pulled up. I walked onto the bus first, and the kid sat behind me, and before he sat down he said, "That was crazy." It was the most serious I'd ever heard him, so I know he at least caught a glimpse of whatever that thing was. Does anyone know what it could have been? Honestly, it still haunts me to this day. I used to do a lot of camping trips with a friend of mine post-college. Most of our trips were in Montana, since that's where we both lived at the time, and that is where this story takes place. My friend Jude and I used to spontaneously leave on camping road trips, where we'd just pick a direction and drive until we found some cool place to hike and camp. Sometimes we'd look up trails and add 1 to 2 days of backpacking adventures to these trips, but more often than not, we would end up in empty campgrounds or pull off on a Forest Service road and set up our tent right outside the car for the night. Looking back, it was wildly irresponsible because we never told anyone where we were going. We almost never had a plan, so if we had gone missing, there would have been no clues as to where to start looking. We almost never had cell service where we camped. So the creepy camping story I have happened in 2020, which was the height of Jude and I's spontaneous camping phase. I had taken a week off work, and we wanted to go up to Glacier and hike and camp for several days, which we did. Since this was during COVID, camping inside the park was not allowed, so we had to find random spots to camp at every night. We stayed at one campground about 180 miles away from West Glacier on the way up, then found a different spot each night closer to the park. All of our campsites near the park were between 10 and 25 miles away from each other because it was difficult to locate spots that were both legal to camp in and hadn't already been taken up by other park goers. This meant that we sometimes spent hours driving up random Forest Service roads looking for somewhere secluded to sleep, but we always managed to find something. The first night of our trip, we stayed at a campground near Drummond, which was about 180 miles from West Glacier. Early in the morning, when it had just started to get light, I heard something walking around the tent. This campground was occupied by a few other campers, so at first I thought that maybe one of them was looking for the bathroom. The steps were very noisy. It was like whoever it was making no effort to be quiet. It was in the grass though, so I couldn't hear individual footfalls. It was more like the sifting through and crushing of grass and twigs, Whatever it was walked within a few feet of our tent, coming from the side facing the woods, not the other campsite or the road. I was only half awake, and I remember thinking two things. One, I'm glad I made sure Jude locked the car, and two, I really hope it's nothing more than a very bold deer, and not a human. I was very tired, and didn't want to think about anything creepy, so I did my best to fall back asleep, and eventually the sounds stopped. Though I don't remember them ever moving away. They just weren't there anymore. Jude had prescribed sleeping pills and was a deep sleeper, so I assumed he'd slept through the whole thing. When we both finally got up for the day, I didn't think anything of it. I didn't mention it to him. The second night, we were up by West Glacier after a long day of hiking and found a spot not too far from the park entrance. It wasn't a designated campground, but it was within a series of dirt roads in a wooded area. We'd seen other people pulled off and camping out their cars, just like we were. Our tent was set right next to the car since there wasn't a lot of open space in the pull-off we found. Again, in the early hours of the morning just when it was getting light. I woke up to hear someone walking around our tent. This time the grass wasn't as tall and I distinctly heard the heavy footsteps of a person walking right next to us, then around the car. Again, I remember being glad that Jude had locked the car the night before. The footsteps had come from the woods, not the road, and continued moving around for a while. Then, they eventually stopped without moving away. I again went back to sleep, then woke up for the day a few hours later with Jude and didn't think anything more of it. I assumed it was someone hiking in the area who cut through our campsite as a shortcut. I didn't mention it to Jude. The third night, it took us a long time to find a campsite. It was pouring rain and we were both exhausted from a 13-mile hike. It took us 3 hours to find a place, and we finally settled on a pull-off off a dirt road above the Hungry Horse Dam. We were both uneasy about this spot, because it wasn't off a Forest Service road, and we were a little worried we'd be bothered by traffic on the road, or cops telling us we couldn't camp there. It was remote, but not remote enough if you know what I mean. The pull-off was kind of a little road that went to nowhere, probably used to push snow onto when ploughing during the winter. It went about 50 yards into the woods, then ended with a dirt mound, and there was an old fire pit and broken glass at the end of it, so we set up our tent near the entrance. It was still pouring rain, and Jude walked around in the mud in his bare feet, while I kept my shoes on and examined the fire pit and broken bottles. Then, we turned in for the night. I noticed too late that Jude had not locked the car, that he was asleep with the keys in his pocket, and I was too tired to get out and do it manually, and it was still raining and I didn't want to get wet. In the morning, just when it was starting to get light, I woke up and heard something walking around in the woods above our tents. I thought it was a deer at first because the steps weren't as loud as the ones I'd heard the previous morning. Then, whatever it was came down onto the pullout where our tent was and began moving around our car. The tent was set up only about 3 feet away from the car, so I could hear whatever it was very distinctly as it walked. The ground was muddy, so the footfalls were more muffled. Then I heard the car door open. I remember I'd only been half awake until that point. I became fully alert then, but was still a little unsure of what I'd actually heard, so I didn't immediately get up. However, I kept listening. Whatever it was kept walking around near the car. There was no sound of another vehicle nearby, so whatever it was had to have walked here, and as I listened, I heard the car door shut. I sat up fully at that point, waking Jude up and said, "I'm going to check that out." I honestly cannot believe my nerve in that moment, but being scared, numb, and sleep-deprived tends to make me stupidly brave. I immediately put on my shoes and opened the tent. By this time, the sound had stopped completely. Remember, the tent was right next to the car on the same side of the wood. I would have heard someone walking away. I got out, and the first thing I noticed was that no one was around or inside the car. It was Jude's car and he was a bit of a mess, so no one would be able to fit in there if they weren't on the front seats anyway. The second thing I noticed was the ground was muddy all around the car and the tent, and the only footprints in the mud were from my trail runners and Jude's bare feet. I even followed his bare feet trail around to make sure every print was his. There were no footprints coming to or from the woods. Nothing. I inspected the car and didn't find anything out of place. No signs of a disturbance, and I walked over to the fire pit and again could only find my own prints. Then, I did the stupidest thing and went past the fire pit into the woods. It was there that I found a weird makeshift shelter made of pallets that had some blankets and women's undergarments in it. Scared the crap out of me initially because I was pretty spooked at this point, and I thought there was a body in there, but upon closer inspection the whole thing was rained out and undisturbed. Nobody had spent the night there in a long while. Even still, I didn't touch anything, and only came within a few feet of the thing before turning around. I returned to the car and sat inside, while I waited for Jude to finish waking up. Then we packed up our tent, and didn't mention it to each other all of that day. On the fourth night, we found a really cool spot below a dirt road on the west side of the park. We got briefly disturbed by a man walking into our campsite. He just seemed to be scouting out a place to camp with his family and didn't know we were there. That evening was otherwise uneventful, and we both went to sleep early because Jude wanted to catch the sunrise, and I was afraid to miss my alarm, so I woke up in the middle of the night and immediately heard something moving around our tent. This time, it was right behind our tent, in the direction of the way we'd come where we'd left the car. I remember being kind of annoyed that this thing had started up so late, when all I wanted to do was sleep. Eventually the sound stopped, and I did fall asleep. In the early hours of the morning we got up and broke camp before it got light. My alarm was loud and woke Jude up too. I forgot about the sounds I'd heard in the night, helped pack up the tent and didn't mention it to him at all. I was pretty happy when we were finally inside the locked car and headed to our next destination. We saw a special sunrise that morning. Afterwards, when we were on our way to grab breakfast and coffee before heading home, Jude looked over to me and said, "Have you been hearing something outside our tent every morning?" I looked at him in shock and said, "Yeah, remember? I got up to investigate it yesterday," and he said, "Yeah, that's really weird. Every morning I've been hearing it too." And we both talked about how strange it was that we both heard it, but neither of us thought it important to mention afterwards. It was like, even though it was really unsettling, something subconscious had made us both think that it was nothing to dwell on. To this day I get shivers when I think about hearing whatever that was, and I'm still astounded by the fact I actually got up one of those mornings to investigate it. But in those moments, even though I remember acknowledging that it was creepy, I don't remember actually feeling very afraid, and clearly, I wasn't too worried, because I hadn't once thought to bring it up to Jude. To this day, Jude is still super unworried and nonchalant about the whole thing, whereas I find it more unnerving each time that I retell this story. What do you all think? A series of unsettling coincidences? Or something else? I went to high school in a small Minnesota town. It's mainly farmland and wooded areas, and it always felt a bit too quiet once you got away from the main roads. One side of my neighborhood was bordered by a relatively large marshland that you could access by a sloping path that wound down from the edge of the street to a narrow trail below. That trail curved its way through the marsh and eventually led into a thick patch of woods about 3/4 of a mile out. In the fall and spring, especially after heavy rain, a dense fog would settle over the marsh, since it sat lower than everything else around it, and it honestly looked like something straight out of a Stephen King novel, just this low rolling blanket of grey that swallowed everything past a few feet. After one of those rains, my younger brother and I, who was probably around 13 at the time and I 16, decided it would be a great idea to go explore the woods while the fog was still thick. The sun was already starting to set, dropping faster than we really accounted for, but we figured we could make it into the woods in about 10 minutes if we left right away. We grabbed a couple of flashlights before heading out, knowing it would be dark by the time we came back, and made our way down towards the trail. The second we stepped onto the trail and started moving, it hit us just how dense the fog really was. We had only been walking for maybe a minute or two, but already we couldn't see anything behind us at all, like the path we had just taken had completely disappeared, and in front of us, visibility was maybe 5 to 10 feet away at best. Everything beyond that just blended into this solid wall of grey. Our voices sounded different too, kind of muffled, like the fog was absorbing everything. We kept going anyway, talking to fill the silence, joking about hearing things in the distance or seeing red eyes staring back at us, even though we couldn't actually see anything that far. After a few more minutes, we reached a curve in the trail, and I knew that meant we were getting close, probably about 100 yards or so from where the woods began. At that point, there was a small lake just off to the left side of the trail, and miles of open marshland stretching out to the right, just flat and empty and hidden under the layers of fog. It's important to mention that by then we were past any houses. Our place had been the closest to the trail, and everything from there moved further out into underdeveloped land rather than running along anyone's backyard. It felt isolated. We had just started walking past the lake when we heard a splash, like something heavy hitting the water. We both stopped immediately and listened. The sound carried weirdly in the fog, and we waited for a few moments, expecting to hear movement or something else that would explain it. But there was nothing. After we'd stayed that way for a while, we just kept on going. We couldn't have taken more than a few steps, maybe 10 or 15 seconds at most, when we heard something else. This time it was crackling and shuffling coming from the brush up ahead on the left, closer to where the lake met the edge of the trail. It wasn't subtle either. It sounded like something moving through thick vegetation without trying to be quiet. We both stopped instantly. Neither of us said anything. We just stood there staring into the fog where the sound had come from, waiting for whatever it was to show itself. At the very edge of what we could see, maybe 10 feet out at most, a figure stepped out from the brush and onto the trail. The fog was too thick to make out clear details, but even with the limited visibility it was obvious that whatever it was big, easily at least 6'4", maybe taller, and broad-shouldered in a way that stood out through the haze. It didn't move like it was startled or cautious either. It just stepped out and stopped in the middle of the trail. My brother let out this sharp, involuntary gasp beside me, and the figure reacted immediately by snapping its head towards us. And even though I couldn't see its face clearly, I just knew that it was looking directly at us. There was no mistaking that feeling. It stood there completely still, staring in our direction. It was like everything had locked into place. It probably only lasted a few seconds, but it stretched out long enough for my brain to fully register what I was looking at, and for the feeling of real terror to settle in. I've never felt that kind of fear before or since. I tried to take a small step backwards, not wanting to trigger anything, and that's when the figure moved. It didn't come towards us, but took off running straight into the marshland on the right side of the trail, disappearing into the fog almost instantly. What stuck with me was how fast it moved, and the direction it chose to move in. There was nothing out there, no buildings or houses for miles, just open marsh and water as far as I knew. The second it disappeared, we turned around and ran. sprinting back the way we came as fast as we could, barely able to see where we were going but not caring. I don't think I've ever run that hard in my life, and neither of us said a word about it until we were almost back at the neighborhood. Even now, I'm not entirely sure what I saw that day, and honestly, I don't think I want to know. I was born and raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, and still live on the east side, and there's a local public park near my parents' house called McAlpine Creek, which is mainly a large cross-country trail stretching for miles across East Charlotte and cutting through areas you wouldn't expect. The park is surrounded by hundreds of acres of dense forest and undeveloped land that somehow sits right in the middle of busy streets and highways, and you almost don't realize how massive the wooded area actually is because of how everything is built up around it. There has always been this local myth or folktale about a devil church or Satan church somewhere deep within the park. And if you look them up, there are a few videos on YouTube and posts scattered on various forums of locals trying to find it, or get close to where they think it is. During my senior year of high school, I went down a rabbit hole reading about it online, just scrolling through old posts and comments, and eventually found a pretty vague description from someone who claimed they had tried to follow some of the back roads deep into the wooded area to get close to where the church was supposedly hidden. My girlfriend at the time and I decided one Friday night that we were going to try and find that road, mostly out of curiosity more than anything else. We drove out behind a Carmax that borders the edge of the woods, where there's a small neighborhood tucked behind there, and I had a few of the street names written down that I thought might get us close to the area the poster described. We were driving slowly through those quiet residential streets, and it was dark, because there were almost no street lamps, and the tree line seemed to press in a lot closer the further we went. After a few minutes of winding through the neighborhood, we came across what looked like an abandoned dirt track branching off from the paved road, barely noticeable unless you were actually looking for something like it. We kept going for another couple of minutes, and there had been a pickup truck ahead of us the whole time, maybe about 50 feet or so in front, just moving at a steady pace. When we finally reached the point where the dirt track spits off, we slowed down and stopped for a second to figure out if we actually wanted to go down it or not. As we started to slowly pull onto the dirt track, the pickup truck ahead of us suddenly stopped completely. It was an abrupt stop that immediately got our attention, and by that point we were already halfway onto the dirt road. We froze watching it, and that's when its reverse lights came on. The driver threw it into reverse and started backing up towards us immediately. We didn't really have anywhere to turn, so I threw my car into reverse without thinking and tried to swing it back towards the paved road as quickly as I could. I managed to get turned around and back into drive, but it felt like it took forever, and as soon as I hit the gas, the truck behind us was already picking up speed in reverse, closing the distance way faster than I expected. I ended up flooring my Nissan Altima, not even caring about the road or anything at that point, just trying to get out of there. For a few moments it felt like they were actually chasing us, like they were matching our speed even more driving backwards, which made it even more unsettling. Then, they just stopped. They didn't turn around or follow us. They just stopped, but we didn't slow down. We got out of the area as fast as we could, both of us pretty shaken up, and trying to act like it wasn't as bad as it felt. But neither of us really said much for a while after that. We never found anything resembling the so-called church, and honestly after that night we didn't try again. Whatever was down that road, whether it was just someone protecting their property or something else entirely, they made sure we never had any intention of going back. This story takes place not even 24 hours ago, when my girlfriend Ava and I decided to take a short walk in her town's forest preserve as we finally started getting warmer weather. The trail starts off on a barren, hilly field that oversees only a handful of houses a few yards away. When we started walking, the sun was beginning to set. The sky was painted in pastel pinks and blues that were slowly fading into a dark, deep blue. Beautiful to see walking in the plains, but as soon as we walked into the forest, the comfort and safety of the childlike colors were covered by a canopy of trees that barely started growing leaves. The trail immediately went from open field into the forests. The trees were sharp, standing straight up. No imperfections in the trunks, no overgrown roots reaching to grab up from the ground, no branches threatening to smack us in the face. As we continued on the trail, just walking and talking as girls do best, all of a sudden both of our eyes darted to the ground as my girlfriend stopped in her tracks, letting out a small noise of disgust and confusion. As we examined the mysterious lump on the ground, we realized how eerie it truly was. Lying in front of our feet was a dead squirrel, which wouldn't seem abnormal, but the squirrel didn't just look dead. It looked as if the life had been sucked from it. The squirrel was in a shriveled up position, sharp fangs like teeth still in its mouth, as well as its sunken in eyes. The squirrel was entirely black, every inch of it, not a hint of variation or discoloration, no lighter tones tucked into the fold of its limbs. Its body showed no sign of decay, just a uniform unnatural blackness. The body had no bugs or flies around it, despite me constantly getting bit by them throughout the walk. It had no odor, no smell of death lingered near it. We couldn't understand how an animal could lose its life so entirely without another creature coming to claim it as food. In the middle of the woods in spring, it felt unnatural, no predator stepping in to carry on the cycle of life. My girlfriend said from the top of her head to the bottom of her toes, she felt a hot vibration flow through every nerve ending in her body. At the same time, I felt a deep pressure that caused every joint in my body to tense up, as well as my chest getting so tight, I started to believe someone punched me the day before. Without hesitation, we decided to turn around, as we are very into trusting our intuition. As we made our journey back to the car, barely a mile out onto the trail, my girlfriend turns to me and asks me if I heard that. I shut my trap and listened, only hearing the leftover echoes of what she heard. She said she could barely make it out, but it sounded like a woman screaming, "Help me." We waited a beat before continuing our walk, trying to beat the now quickly setting sun. We walked in silence, focused on getting the hell out of there, both of our bad feelings increasing with every step we take. I began to hear the screams myself, but they were sounding further and further away, which I found odd, because from where my girlfriend initially heard the screams to where we were now, the individual screaming would have had to have quickly jumped into a car to drive another mile or so away from us. That's how quick these screams got further and further away. And as I thought about it, I had a realization that made my stomach drop. I told my girlfriend that we just needed to get out, and we needed to get out now, as the screams continued and got further. We exited the forest just as the green flash of the sun appeared, and the screams just came to a stop. I explained to my girlfriend about a Filipino urban legend I grew up with, about a certain aswang, manananggal or tik-tik, a demon creature that in the daylight will disguise itself as a human dog or cat or any ordinary creature you see in the day, but when it comes to dusk, it turns into a soul-sucking vampire, and that it's most infamous for the further it sounds, the closer it really is. I once went fishing near a forest at a creek, pretty close to a nature preserve. I had been fishing for about 2 hours when I noticed someone yelling, "Hey!" multiple times, within a few seconds in between. At first I thought it was maybe just an owl, but it sounded very human and was spaced out like a person calling. So I responded with, "Hello?" After a few seconds of dead silence, no forest noises or anything other than a few splashes, and the creature replied, "Come here." It could have just been because I was paying closer attention, but it sounded slightly closer. The only issue was that this particular creek had absolutely nothing behind it except for miles of woods and a few swamps. It was starting to get dark. What's even stranger is that whoever or whatever it was never yelled again. I got extremely paranoid that someone was watching me, and every muscle in my body told me to grab everything and leave. It was the longest trip back to my car, which, terrifyingly, was through a small portion of the wood. I haven't been able to stop thinking about my experience camping in Jamaica State Park in Vermont in August. My boyfriend and 2 other friends went up for a long weekend to do a camping Vermont road trip. The first night we stayed in Jamaica State Park, where I used to go as a kid all the time, while we were setting up camp and sitting by the fire at night, we were astonished by how quiet it was. There were no birds or cicadas or crickets, none of the regular sounds of the woods that we are used to hearing while camping. We didn't think anything of it. When I was falling asleep, I noticed the eerie feeling of it just being so quiet. I ended up falling asleep, but woke up in the middle of the night to a banging sound. The campground is a loop, and I first heard this sound right on the road alongside our tent. I couldn't hear any shuffling, as if someone was walking while hitting something. When other people walked onto the trail to the bathroom, I could hear footsteps. This was just a clanging type sound, almost as if someone were hitting a metal pan. The sound was loud and deep, and the sound continued around the camp loop twice, maybe lasting 20 or so minutes. The bang also continued at the same steady metronome the entire time. I've never been so scared. I'm pretty comfortable in the woods, have camped alone and gone backpacking. I've camped alongside bears and other animals, but never felt as scared as I was that night. I was completely frozen and too paralyzed to move. I kept running through my head any explanation, but couldn't come up with anything logical, and after looping the campground twice, the sound eventually stopped and I fell asleep. The next morning I asked my friend group if anyone had heard it. Only one of my friends also said he heard it the whole time and described it exactly as I had. We just laughed it off and joked about it. We came to the conclusion that it was a moose, although I wasn't convinced. I asked the park ranger if moose are ever in the area, and she laughed and said no. It would be very uncommon to see one, and I explained the noise we had heard, and she said she'd listen as she fell asleep tonight and would report back if she heard anything. The next night we went to sleep, all on edge, prepared to look outside our tent if we heard the noise again. We did not end up hearing anything, and in the morning we left the campground and headed north to the next. We continued to joke about it through the weekend, but couldn't come up with any logical explanation. There was an ambulance in the morning at the site across from ours, but I don't think it has anything to do with it. Fast forward to the morning of October the 23rd, and I was scrolling TikTok when I saw a video talking about the Bennington Triangle. I want to emphasize that I didn't follow conspiracy theories and don't really believe in ghosts. I looked into the location and found that we were camping right outside the supposedly haunted area. Looking into this a little more, I found that people commonly report hearing sounds similar to what we heard. I wonder if anyone has any insight on what I could have heard, or hopefully have a logical explanation for it. I'm a police officer in a very rural area in northern Canada. About 2,000 people and 5 to 6 reserves and settlements nearby. Very early in the morning we responded to a call. This guy is threatening to kill a victim over stupid stuff, so we attend. It's in one of the settlements that's very forested, pitch black all around and muddy roads. We go find the place, talk to the victim, and make a plan that the two of us stay back for security and the others go locate and arrest the guy. I ended up staying back with my partner. He stays out by the road, a good 100 or more yards away from the house. I can see his lights, he can see mine. Radio reception is bad, but it's how it is up there. I do my usual police stuff, speak to the victim and family inside, info details, etc. But I ended up walking out of the house and get this awful feeling of what I can only describe as dread. It's awful feeling, and now I feel like I'm being watched by someone or something in the woods. I get back to my truck, hop in, lock the door, and I'm playing with the lights. I turn on the front one, and it lights up the dark tree area no problem. I turn my eyes to the left, and turn on my left side alley lights, and I get the worst feeling I've ever felt in my life. I don't see anything at all. Dark spots behind trees due to shadows, that's normal. But I feel like I'm looking at something I shouldn't be looking at. My eyes start feeling like they're vibrating, and I start getting dizzy. I just feel like it was pure terror for me, as at that moment, that feeling and pressure. So I quickly look away, and as soon as I do, my eyes go back to normal. I look all around except where I just looked at and it's normal. But as soon as I look that way, the feeling returns, like something is forcing me to stop. I looked back a few times to see if I could somehow just turn my head, but it's not happening at all. I drove to where my partner was, the only entrance to the house, and sat and talked to him about stuff. I didn't really tell him because I didn't think he would believe me. His car is kind of beside the tree line, and while talking to him car to car, I get the urge to look up at the trees and that awful feeling returns. So I look away. I end up going back to the house, not looking at the forest where I felt that feeling, talking to the victim about additional information. I started walking back. I hear a noise to my left. Different parts of the forest closer to the house. I turn my flashlight on, and nothing is there on ground level. I moved my eyes up higher in the trees, and that awful feeling comes back, and I'm filled with fear and dread. And I actually ended up falling down a bit just from feeling pushed down or my legs giving way. The victim saw me and asked if I was okay, and I said I was fine and just sped and walked to my car. We get the all clear and we all start preparing to leave and go down the driveway. And I just feel a death stare the entire way I'm going past the patch of trees, like I'd pissed something off. I have absolutely no idea what that was, what was going on or anything. That was not me being tired. It wasn't me being exhausted. Can anyone help me describe what it could have been? Because I've been dreading it ever since I got home, and I can't get it out of my mind. I lived in Utah for a year. For the first 2.5 months of that time, I was out there on my own, sleeping in my old Rover and wandering around the Colorado Plateau. I did a lot of exploring, picking up a wash and following it down, going around impassable pour-offs and heading deeper into canyons while hoping I would scramble back out. There were no footprints or any signs of other humans, just the feel of the place and its spirits. Well, on 2 occasions, I ran into some unwelcoming ones. The feeling was strong, like the area was not meant for humans. I would leave some tobacco, pour out a shot of water, and apologize and get out. Well, one morning, after a 2-hour drive down a barely visible 2-track that I lost in the dark, I camped for the night. In the light of day, I picked it up again and followed it to the end of the slick rock edge of a deep canyon. I brewed some coffee and set out a chair to watch the sun climb down the canyon wall, and I had been sitting there for maybe half an hour when, in the complete quiet, I heard distinct footsteps running up behind me. It took as long as it took me to think who could be out there running this far back at this hour, maybe a Tarahumara runner or something, but I was already getting up out of my chair when I turned around to look and took off my sunglasses to greet whoever it was. There was no one there. I camped at that spot for 5 days and did not see or hear another person the whole time. I wandered along the rim for miles one day out to a point and climbed down a few tiers into one of those unwelcoming zones I mentioned. I think the southwest corner is a wild region that's full of spirits. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening to day 1 of Nature Week. I hope that you enjoyed. I will be back tomorrow with even more scary stories. It is going to be middle of nowhere, followed by cabins on Wednesday, haunted woods on Thursday, and finishing up with some cryptids on Friday. And if you didn't know already, we actually have a podcast called the Mort's Bedtime Stories Podcast. Episode 92 is going to be dropping, or should have dropped already actually, and it's cabin stories, so it's going to be good. I'd like to give an extra special and final thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. And if you'd like some bonus content throughout the week, feel free to head on over to Patreon and check that out. There should be a special video coming out on Wednesday for that. But for now, I'm going to wrap things up here. Stay awesome, guys, and hopefully see you tomorrow. Good night.